Hello and welcome to the Jazz History Database. Today's November 8, 2017. My name is Professor Rich Falco. I'm Director of Jazz Studies at WPI, which is Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Mass., and founder and director of the Jazz History Database. Today we welcome an artist who has had a profound impact on the jazz scene, aside from her international performances as a jazz vocalist and recording artist. She's founder and director of a nonprofit jazz preservation organization, and is currently the executive director of the only jazz radio station still operating in New England. She comes from a very musical family, and I'm hoping that she'll share some information about the careers even of her parents, who are well-known musicians as well. Please welcome today's guest, Amanda Carr.
Thank you.
It's really nice to have you here, and we've been looking forward to this.
Thanks, Rich.
So tell me a little bit about your father, Nicky Capizzuto, and about your mom, Nancy Carr.
They were very different people. My dad grew up in East Boston, so a lot of great jazz players came out of the East Boston neighborhoods, the North Shore, in Boston in general. He was in the Navy band. He actually went to, I guess there was a music school in Washington that you went to for however long, a couple of months, and then he was actually in the Navy and on a destroyer, and his job was to play in the Navy band. There were a lot of ceremonies that happened, whether you were in Cape Town, South Africa, where the general or whoever it was on the boat had to give ceremonies, and that's what he did. When he got off in 1945, he was released from the Navy. The war was over, and he was in New York, and one of his best friends was Don Costa, who, I don't know if you know that name, but a pretty famous producer, also from the East Boston area, and said, "Hey, Nicky, I can get you on all these great big bands, just subbing on all these bands." So, of course, my dad at the time, who was a very good reader, good trumpet player, great phrasing, he used to play like not first trumpet, but second or third, subbed on a lot of name bands at that time, and there was always something going on live in New York. There were all those live radio shows, but he ended up for a year touring and recording with Tex Beneke when Edie Gourmet was the singer and Mel Lewis was on drums. Probably, I'm trying to think of when he came to the Boston area, but he went to the Schillinger House, and that's what Berkeley was called. Originally it was called Schillinger House, and then it was called something else in between just Berkeley, like it was the name of the people that owned it, Berkeley something. But there were a lot of professional musicians as students there. I don't know exactly how it worked, but they were either taking classes or forwarding their education. But in some of the classes my dad had was people like Arif Mardin and Quincy Jones, and also Herb Pomeroy was teaching at the time, and he ended up playing in Herb's band as one of the members of the band. And my dad was a very, very funny guy. Part of his leverage and cachet, people wanted him around, was the fact that he had a great sense of humor. And, back then, when you're hanging out with the band or you're on the bus for how many weeks, it was really important to have people that had that personality that actually added to the whole vibe of the band and how people connected and played. So he had quite a career, and then, just kind of tapered off when big bands tapered off. So, in the 70s, pretty much any band that was just trying to hang in there kind of dissolved, and he had a different career at that point of...
Well, let me jump in here, because I have a couple of things I want to ask you about. First, I know that he had performed with the Woody Herman Band, Glenn Miller,
sure,
Louis Prima,
sure,
Harry James. I mean, he was really around before he settled into back into the Boston area and was performing with the Herb Pomeroy Band. But there is actually a reason why Berkeley, or was originally the Schillinger House, became so popular, as did New England Conservatory eventually, and they had to do the GI Bill. So according to,
I never knew that, so that's...
So Dick Vaca is a wonderful historian who's written about the Boston
I have
Jazz.
that book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It is a great book. I think he mentioned my dad in there, too. Yeah.
And the fact is, because so many musicians after World War II were taking advantage of the GI Bill, they went to the Schillinger House, eventually Berkeley School of Music, then Berkeley College of Music, and New England Conservatory, and anyone else who was offering some level of education, especially in the jazz field. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Let's move over to your mom for a second.
Okay, very different trajectory. My mom grew up in New Hampshire, in Manchester, and basically she was the oldest of 7 kids on a farm in Manchester. But my grandmother had a quartet. My grandmother actually played stride piano, and she was a real, as she would say, a real pip. I mean, she was a French-Canadian, but just loved music and just really got out there, kind of a pioneer. Didn't really adhere to a lot of the standards of what, housewives and mothers should be doing, but she was really a proponent of just getting out there and playing. So my mom started singing early on, and she sang in a band. I'm trying to think of, the last name was Carrie, and I can't remember the first name, but she ended up with the Ted Herbert Band, which is a big band up there. And then she ended up, her name at the time was Carmen Akins, and back then you had your name up on a marquee, like who was the singer that night, and it was really important for people because it's usually a mecca for dancers to come, and so they wanted to know who the singer was. And Carmen was both a male and a female name, and nobody knew if it were a male singer, female singer, so she changed her name early on to Nancy Carr, and Carr came from Carmen, and that way it was definitely feminine, people knew. But she ended up being basically the house singer for the house band for the Totem Pole Orchestra, the Bob Batchelor Totem Pole Orchestra, for a number of years, which was in Norumbega Park, which now I think that there's a Marriott that sits on that land, but it was a huge ballroom. There are photos online, and you probably have some of them. She's reached out and connected with the sons and daughters of the owners, but so many great bands came through, and name bands and regional bands came through that club, and it was a beautiful ballroom. And some of the rules were, like, for example, you couldn't go there stag, you couldn't go there without a date, or you couldn't just be a single guy and go there. There was such a level of decorum back then. I think it was alcohol free too.
It was?
Yeah, and this is all just things I'm just remembering off the top of my head, but until it burned down in the 60s, she was the singer there. Later on, she, out of, I don't know, having to support a couple of kids as a single mother, she ended up doing like the lounge circuit. The club scene. So she was back in the 70s when, the Hiltons and the Sheratons had live bands 5-6 nights a week. She was one of those bands.
This would be more with quartets and quintets?
Exactly, yeah. And she ended up meeting my stepfather, who at that time, who was a fantastic organ player, who actually went to Berkeley when organ was a major. Yeah. There was actually it was an organ major. Wow. So he actually went there when it was actually offered. So
what is his name?
His name, he passed away, but his name is Michael Cardoza. Mm-hmm. And a very, very good player. I mean, kick off your shoes with your stocking feet, and great bass pedal player and B3 player. That was his main instrument, was B3 versus piano. So they had a trio together, and that's really what attracted me to start singing and playing. It was not in the jazz genre or the American Songbook. That didn't happen till years later. But that's what I started doing at a very early age, where I started professionally just putting together my songs and my gigs and going out as a single and playing and singing at probably age 14.
And you were playing piano and singing?
Playing piano and singing, pop music of the day, everything from, I grew up on James Taylor and Carly Simon and Carole King, and all the Fleetwood Mac and all the 70s music that's now popular, except that has the word classic in front of it. But that's what I grew up in, and that's really, even though I took classical piano lessons from age 5, my real interest level was in pop music at that day, and that's where I began.
Through your college years or high school years, or where were you age-wise when you were doing that?
I started at 14.
Yeah,
so my stepfather actually dropped me off at my first gig up the street, and it was actually in a place where it was a restaurant and a lounge. But back then, you really had a lot more freedom as a kid to do things out in the public. We really weren't micromanaged by people afraid of their kids, walking to school, or, oh my God, the bus needs to stop at every driveway. I mean, we could actually go out and experience and be musicians. And And, people in the neighborhood will watch out for you, or as long as somebody drove you home or picked you up that was an adult, I mean, it was okay to do. I played in bands in clubs where, even though back then the legal age was 18, it wasn't 21, you still could kind of get away with going in there as long as somebody kind of watched out for you. It really wasn't as strict as it was today. This was before drunk driving laws got very strict and Dukakis was in office, et cetera. So I had opportunities at a young age to actually be a professional and be in those environments, and really that does help you to form and be expressive on a continuum in the real world and real settings versus sterilized settings that I think that happens a lot now, and I call it the plastic steering wheel. When you give a child a plastic steering wheel and they pretend they drive, you really got to get out there and experience that kind of...
That's quite that's a wonderful statement, and actually a real insight into what goes on in academic institutions, which are very sterile. And folks who are attending music schools very often don't have much opportunity to perform. Certainly nothing like when I was coming up or when you were coming up.
Right.
Where, man, you could be gigging 7 nights a week,
And that's what we did, and you were. And
year after year.
Year after year. And that was kind of your school, because there's nothing like learning on the job, no matter what. Even if you go to a college where it's a 5-year college and it's a co-op program and you're out, whatever your major is, and you're actually working in a company, your classes even now have more of a context because there's something to stick to rather than information. That's one thing, but then there's the experience and how that information becomes, now it's knowledge. So there's a big difference between information and knowledge. So I never went to typical music school. I did go for a short time for classical performance. It really just wasn't my thing, although it has informed. Every little bit helps, even if that's what you don't decide to pursue 100%. Everything informs your expression, no matter what you do in music. Everything does add to that. So I'm informed in my jazz singing or my American songbook singing. I'm informed by my pop music sensibilities. I'm informed by all those piano lessons I took in classical. I'm informed by all of that, and that feeds into how I filter my expression or how I deliver. You can't extricate yourself from your musical experiences or really who you are as a person and how you express yourself. So, and I think that in the end, that's what jazz is. There's a lot of, as you know, being in academia, there are people that say, well, if you didn't go to school or if you have a degree, then we're validating you because of that, where I didn't have any of that. So I don't look for that validation. I look for just, hey, I don't know, call me a jazz singer, don't call me a jazz singer. I really don't feel I have a label, and I don't need one. And that's what jazz really is.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
That's what it really was supposed to be, is just pure expression without having to think that you have to scat or you have to do this or you have to follow this line of curriculum or else it's not validated. So I came in through the side door in that way.
Yes, and being a true performing artist, there is quite a distinction between that and someone who's in the academic field or coming up that way. Certainly I was a performer for years before I got into academia. It was like a whole different thing, and I think I brought those sensibilities with me as well. So I certainly know where you're coming from on that. I found it really interesting that a lot of your career, at least at one point, was focused back on big bands, and you were doing things with Artie Shaw, Harry James,
Glenn Miller, and Fred Radke, Harry James, he was that,
And were you touring with them, or just guest spots, or how did that work?
Basically, I was known as the singer that if they were in town and they were doing, a show, and their regular singer or they needed a singer, they knew that I could cut the gig, and they knew that I could present their material. They knew that I was basically a good call.
Yeah.
So most of those bands already had a regular singer. But for example, Julia Rich, who very rarely takes a day off. I mean, she lives and breathes the Glenn Miller band. It's one of the few touring bands that actually tours as much as they do and has an actual band, not a pickup band.
That's right.
she calls me. So I know the material, I'm able to show up prepared and basically sing in that style, which really, it's just a very natural fit for me, and it came from me filling in for my mom and listening all those years. I mean, when I was a kid, jazz music or big band music or the American Songbook was like driving their station wagon. It was just like my parents' music. Yeah, it was around, or that's what my dad did, or my mom. But I had no interest whatsoever. That was just what my parents did. But it all went in. So what had happened is when I returned from Los Angeles, from a whole different stint there, and I was back in Boston, my mom asked me to fill in. Hey, Amanda, can you fill in on these gigs for me? Which is no big deal. But then the light bulb went off, and it was partly because I was a little bit older, partly because maybe I had grown musically or grown personally and could really appreciate the depth of this music. And now I'm listening to these lyrics and I'm saying, wow, this music is really cool. And then coupled by the fact that just the natural sound of my voice lent itself to this genre. So we call that raw goods. So no matter how schooled you are, or you might have all the vocal aerobics down and run the lines and be able to do all that, it comes down to your sound. So you either are fortunate enough to have a particular sound, you can't change that. Your sound is your sound. You can enhance it or optimize it the best way possible, but some people just don't have a good sound, or it doesn't lend itself to a certain genre. But in particular, my sound just happened to lend itself to that. So it was easy for me to be natural in it. And that's how I kind of came to say, hey, this is kind of cool music, and this is hip, and I wonder what I'd sound recording it, or I wonder, what I'd sound doing that. So it really wasn't an effort in, I really want to study this, I want to go to school. It was just like, wow, I think I really like this, and I'd like to sing more of it or explore more of it.
Yeah, and what I love about your singing, if you don't mind my personal commentary here.
Oh, no, please.
Yeah, but what I really love about it is that within the frame of a very strict arrangement, and everyone in the ensemble, except for the singer, has this opportunity to read the charts properly and to listen to everyone in the ensemble. But the singer's out in front, you have a lot of flexibility, and you take advantage of that, You're not singing just stiffly the lyrics of the tune or whatever. You're really selling it and getting yourself in there.
It's a good word, selling, because there's a difference between just being a musician and being an entertainer. And I grew up in an era where I was schooled when I started to sing this material. A lot of the older guys, well, now older, a lot of them obviously have passed away, that they were part of my father's contingency or my mother's contingency. And they basically, no matter if they were a drummer or if they were a horn player, they taught me how to sing by telling me what not to do. So I was schooled by the old school thought of stick to the melody, don't oversing, which is really which is really kind of an epidemic with singers, is they oversing, they over emote, they overdo their vocal aerobics. It's the look what I can do versus people sitting out there. How are you going to connect with your listener, and what are they hearing, and where's the subtlety and the nuance? And if you're able to, and there's a lot of space in between notes. And the more that you really understand this music, the more you realize that you can have the patience to sing a ballad, or how do you sell this song, but really it's about how you tell this story, and how can I connect this emotionally using all this stuff in my toolbox. And it's not about the glitter or the flashy or the loud or the volume, it's about all those little things that add up to a quality performance. And I was taught that by all these old cats. So I never really scat because, it just wasn't a natural thing for me to do. But to speak to what you're saying, I want to be expressive and interesting and take some phrases, but I try to ride that fine line of not overdoing it. What can I add that's subtle but makes it turn a phrase differently.
Yeah, exactly. And when I was talking about flexibility, it feels so organic when you're singing. It's not at all contrived. It certainly comes from a rooted tradition, but it's you expressing, which is really the point of all of this, you know? So how do we go from here into your creating the American Big Band Preservation Society?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm no longer affiliated with it, except that I was the founder, and I'll go into that as briefly as I possibly can, but this all came about when I was working with producer-drummer Kenny Hadley on an album called Common Thread. And it really was, hey, let's do a big band album. Let's take Bob Friedman, who knew my dad. Let's take some of these great arrangers while they're still around, and let's do a record. And again, it's just the next step in Amanda's evolution of you know, taking on a unique project, and how am I going to sound, or what am I going to learn from this? So as we were hanging out, and just I want to mention too that that we actually wanted to use some of the guys, the older guys that played with my dad on that record.
Right, so let's frame this just for a moment. So Kenny Hadley, drummer, big band from Boston.
Yes.
That he's had for many years.
One of the best big bands in the country.
I agree.
And it also has a very East Coast feel to the band versus the West Coast big bands that are just a little bit more, not sterile, but just a little bit more behaved. They don't have the feng shui and the grit that some of the East Coast big bands have.
Good. All right, so you're hanging out with Kenny.
Yeah, and somebody like Dave Chapman, who actually went to, we knew he didn't have much longer that he could play, and we actually moved up our whole schedule of recording because we knew that he wouldn't have the lung power, and he actually went to the gym, and he came in with his oxygen, and he got that record done, and he passed away not that long after it, but we just wanted to pay homage to some of these great sounds. So Dave Chapman had such a beautiful sound, sax sound. Also Lynn Biviano, who I wanted to have on this record. So we had some good names on this record, and then some of your usual suspects. But in all of this, hanging out and you know, working through these charts and rehearsing, there was this conversation on, hey, where are all these charts going? At one point, there were 4,500 big bands in the United States. I mean, this was our cultural fabric through 2 world wars. Everybody went out and danced. This is what we all did. This is how we all got together. This is what we did on Friday and Saturday night as couples. This is what our America was. And yet all these band leaders are passing away, and where are their charts going? Schools don't have the places to store them or keep them, and students don't necessarily want to play them. You know, that's kind of old music. It's great and nobody's learning how to write, you know, arrangements, because it's an art form. And even if you learn on a computer, you're looking at one screen at one time, whereas the art really is, where are you coming from and where are you going? So even the organic nature of writing charts or arrangements, we're losing that too. So this was really part of our musical heritage that is ending up in closets. Families don't know what to do with them. Nobody's playing them, and we're losing an art form that once it's gone, you know, it's hard enough to pass down basic stuff to the next generation, let alone an art form like that. So we decided to maybe begin a 501c3. A few of us got together, Kenny Hadley being one of them, Al Dean, who's a host over at WICN, and a few other people who were on the original board of directors, and we created a 501c3 with the purpose of having a place so that we could bring this in, venture to digitize this music, share it, get it out to anybody and everybody that wants to play it, and also hear it live. As you know, there's a big difference between listening to a recording and actually experiencing, not only listening to a big band live live and that visceral experience, but also playing within the context as a musician in a big band environment. Very, very different than just listening to a recording. So that's part of that. There's a lot of aspects, and even though this organization couldn't be all things, it's a step in the right direction. And of course, everything takes money, time. So a number of years back, maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I realized that I needed to pass the torch to somebody that was a little bit younger, that had a little bit more energy and knowledge to carry on the American Big Band Preservation Society, because I just couldn't at that time dedicate what needed to be dedicated to the organization. So Dan Gable, as you know, is the new CEO and vision for it, and we're hoping that maybe he can take that to the next level.
Yes, and in fact, the Jazz History Database has partnered with Dan and the American Big Band Preservation Society, I'm happy to say, and we're working on trying to help preserve some of those materials. So that's wonderful. What year was that founded?
2009, I believe. Okay. So it wasn't all that long ago. Mm-hmm. And then, the kind of be careful what you wish for. Two things happen. Nat Hentoff, who I don't know if you're familiar with. Oh, yeah. He caught wind of me as a vocalist and wrote about me on the front page of the Arts and Leisure section for the Wall Street Journal, and that's when overnight, all of a sudden, I was a jazz singer when I had no idea what that was, but I better learn. And then the next article was about the American Big Band Preservation Society in the Wall Street Journal. So we were a little unprepared, I think.
I wasn't aware of the article. Okay, I knew about your article, your personal career, but I wasn't aware.
So what had happened was we had a whole bunch of phone calls like, hey, I'm interested, and hey, can you... when are you going to digitize this? Hey, can we have some of those charts? Or, hey, I have all this music. Can you come out to Utah and come into my garage and evaluate my arrangements? So we were just unprepared, just getting this together. But what it did tell me is that there's a tremendous amount of interest in it, and given the opportunity and the funding, I think that this is necessary, and I'm hoping that possibly through WPI or greater resources, that these arrangements can be digitized and shared.
Yeah, and shared, exactly.
And stored, because there's a lot of that. There's a lot of scribbling on these charts.
Yeah, we actually have a portion of the Jazz History Database that we call In Their Own Hand. And we can actually look at the handwriting of artists where they're erasing a chord structure and replacing it, or putting white out over a melody. And it's wonderful to see the process unfold, which you don't get from it.
You don't get from that. And it really is all about the process. When we all look and we study jazz and we study these artists, when you can understand, like for me, I'm a big fan of the Beatles. So when I see stuff with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and I see that kind of thing of how they came to this melody or what was their thought process, I am absolutely fascinated by that. Now I'm really into the DNA of the process.
That's wonderful. And then you jump there, and you are now currently the executive director at WICN Radio.
Yes, this is where I cross. Yeah, this is how that happened. It's really interesting. And it's almost like, what did Rodney Dangerfield, actually probably before Rodney Dangerfield said that I don't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member, and it's kind of how I feel about this in some ways. But WICM Public Radio was the first radio station to give me my official big girl interview when I started to record in the American Songbook, and just to start to record in general. They made me feel legitimate. They legitimized me as somebody that they felt was worthy of an interview and to play my material, and it really gave me the confidence and a platform by which I grew. For whatever a career is, I grew a career, and I was forever grateful. And they have always been my home base, and I've always felt very familial with them. They have a very open policy. They make everybody feel worthy, whether you're a brand new artist like I'm going to do today when I go to Mechanics Hall and these people coming from Berkeley, to make them feel important, legitimate, and that really does mean a lot, and it goes a long way. So fast forward 20 years later, when they had gone through a couple of GMs or general managers, and part of this job is not only keeping the radio station on air, and it's a lot of engineering and technical stuff that I'm, learning, but it's about getting this station out into the community, finding ways that we can be connecting with artists, with the community, and especially nowadays, partnering with resources. And now that we're online and downloading apps, how do we get this music to the next generation? How do we be inclusive? What can we do for our future to remain viable and keep this music on air? So that's why they chose me in this position, because they know that I generally have that vision and that mindset, and I have demonstrated that within my own career of how to get out into the community. And I'm naturally a networker, and I look at ways of saying, hey, you've got the roller skate, I have the key, how do we make this happen? And ultimately, my goal has really very little to do with me. It's actually you have to be pretty selfless to do this, but it's really, you have to be passionate about the goal of sharing this with other people and aggregating it and generating other people to have a passion for it.
And as you know, we at WPI, but especially the Jazz History Database, has partnered for many projects with WICN. So congratulations on your work there. I know you need to scoot off to Mechanics Hall to do a live broadcast there and introduce the ensemble.
Yeah, it's my first time I'm usually the ensemble, so this is the first time that I'm, and it is a skill set that I don't have, so I'm a little nervous about it.
Well, we'll be listening. So.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Well, congratulations on everything you've done and all you brought to the table, and thank you very much for taking the time today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.